Now I'm excited today because I recently got this replica of one of the most famous ancient Greek inscriptions from Judea-Palestine, known as the Theodotos Inscription. It goes back to the 1st century. Now, I got this from the Institute of Biblical and Scientific Studies gift shop. It's IBSS gift shop. You can go to bibleandscience.com to find it. And they have all sorts of cool things like this, right? So they have replicas of ancient inscriptions, replicas of things like Roman wax tablets and Hebrew and Greek inscriptions, all sorts of artifacts from the ancient world, replicas that you can get, little models of Jerusalem. It's really cool. So I'd highly recommend going there, bibleandscience.com, if you want something like this, or this one itself, or other things like this. You'd enjoy it. Now, what are we going to do in this video today? Well, I thought because I now have this really cool replica of an ancient inscription that we would go through it, and we would read through it in Greek together, and I could offer some cultural, historical, and linguistic commentary on it, and in that way we could see, both get a little practice of what it's like to read an inscription in Greek, and then also to take from it all sorts of things that we can learn about the culture, the history, and the language, and to see just how much you can get from reading an inscription closely. So let's jump right into it. Okay? Theodotos. So the inscription begins with a name, Theodotos. Now, interestingly, as we'll learn from the rest of the inscription, it's written by a Jewish man about building a synagogue in Jerusalem, right? But he clearly has a Greek name, Theodotos. Now, we might surmise, if you look at kind of the breakdown of the name, Theos and then Dotos, God and gift, or God giving, those sorts of meanings in the stems, it might parallel the Hebrew name like Yonatan, the Lord gives, or Elnatan, God gives, or Netanel, God gives, but just the reverse order. And it's possible then that the name of this man in Hebrew was something like Yonatan or Elnatan or Netanel, and Theodotos was his Greek name, right? And we see that in some cultures even today, when someone is dealing with different communities, they might have a name in their own language and then a name in the language of the community in which they live. And we see this even in the New Testament, right? Paul, whom most people know as Paul, was named Shaul in Hebrew, right? So he had a Hebrew name Shaul, and then he had a Greek name Pavlos. And so we see things like that. And so that might be what's going on here. Theodotos might be a Greek name, whereas his Hebrew name would be Yonatan or Netanel. Or it is possible that he just had one name and it was Greek, of course, because there's a lot of interaction between Judaism and Hellenism and Greek and Hebrew in this time. So that is a possibility as well. But we begin with his name. Right, and when you are dealing with a building inscription that's saying who built something, you often begin with the person who built the building. You begin with their name, and then you proceed to say a little bit about them before detailing the work of the building. Okay, so what do we have? We have Theodotos Wetenu. Okay, notice Theodotos is in the nominative. We have the os. Then Wetenu is in the genitive. We have the u. Wetenu meaning Wetenos, it's another name, but now in the genitive. So Theodotos of Wetenus means Theodotos, son of Wetenos. And Wetenos is interesting because it's actually a Latin name. Now, some people have taken that and extrapolated. Some scholars have thought, well, maybe that means that we're actually dealing with a Jewish family from Italy, from Rome, who's immigrated to Jerusalem. And we'll see later in the inscription, there's reasons for thinking that Theodotos and his family came from abroad. And so Wetenos, a Latin name, maybe this means that the family's from Italy or from Rome. Now that's possible, but we can't read too much into a name because in the ancient world, sometimes people would have various reasons for choosing certain names if they were in use in their culture. And it doesn't have to mean that they came from a certain place, right? You can have a different culture's name just because you like it or just because that's in your environment. We don't necessarily have to attribute too much to the use of that name. One other thing to mention here is it begins with omicron ypsilon, right? U in Greek, which is corresponding to the Latin sound w, right? Now we think sometimes in Latin, based on our pronunciation today of Latin, that V or U is a V. Now it would eventually come to be pronounced that way, but in the ancient period it was pronounced as W. So not vetenus, but vetenus. And it is true actually that already around this time there was sort of slow movement for W to become V and then to become V. That process was already beginning, and so this could be a conservative orthography, but in either case, the orthography, whether conservative or contemporary, it's reflecting the W sound, vetenus. Okay? So we have Theodotos, vetenu. Theodotos, son of vetenus. Ierevs, a priest, right? So we said in building inscriptions, you often get the person's name followed by an introduction of kind of who they are, their heritage, and what they do. So now we're getting what he does, right? He's an ierevs, a priest. And that's interesting because if this synagogue was in Jerusalem and he's a priest, that might mean that he actually even had some interaction in the temple or officiated in the temple or did some of his service in the temple. We can't know, but it's possible given its proximity. I mean, this was found just south of the Temple Mount, right around the Ophel in the city of David. So this is a possibility. Okay, so he's ierevs. Ke and this part's cut off, but a ro should be here. Archisynagogos. Archisynagogos, we see this term mentioned in the New Testament. It means simply the chief, the head of a synagogue. Okay? Now, there's different interpretations among scholars of what exactly this term means. Did it mean somebody who sort of presided over the synagogue, had a formal role in the synagogue, maybe had some teaching or other sort of authority there? Or is it just an honorary term that you could give to someone because they did something good for the synagogue or gave to the synagogue or were regarded as esteemed? Now, there seem to be actually pieces of evidence that support both, and I think it was probably a fairly malleable term where it could mean something formal or it could mean something more kind of honorific as an honorific title. So you can't know for sure anytime you see this term, other than according to the context, what exactly it means. As we'll see here, it probably does mean something more formal, that he had a formal role in the synagogue. Why? Because we have, okay, he's archisynagogos, ios archisynagogu, right? Ios, the son, archisynagogu, of an archisynagogos, right? So the son of a synagogue ruler. Right here you have the nominative, right? Because it's referring to Theodotos. Archisynagogos, os, going back to Theodotos. And then ios archisynagogu, right? So you're dealing with the genitive now. Archisynagogu, right? Just like we had the son of vetenos, now the son of an archisynagogos. So he's also the son of an archisynagogos, which is why I think here it might be more of a formal role because it's kind of in succession here. And then, once again, Ionos, the grandson, so Ionos, grandson, archisynagogu, right? So we have here now, he's not just an archisynagogos himself, but also his father and his grandfather were both archisynagogi. And that's why I think it's perhaps more of a formal thing in this context. Okay, so that's who he is, right? We learn he's son of vetenos, and he's an ierevs and an archisynagogos from a long line of archisynagogi, right? So he has a history of being very involved in the synagogue, perhaps even having a position of authority there. And he himself is a priest, which might mean he even officiates and serves in the temple. Now we get our verb, right? So we mentioned in building inscriptions, you often get the name, a little background of who they are, their heritage, what they do, and then the verb to say they founded or established or built, whatever it is. Now here, o ko domese. He built, right? From ikodomin, ikodomese, to build. Now there's two interesting points here linguistically. One, actually both scribal features. First, omega, and then kappa, right? If you're writing this formally today, you're going to write omega with the iota subscript underneath, right? Because it's coming from that root omicron iota kappa omicron sigma ikos, or in, more common pronunciation you might hear oikos, but ikos, house, right? And so that iota is still tucked away in there. And so we would write today a iota subscript there to show that there's a iota. Now that's a medieval invention, the iota subscript. In ancient times, they would either write iota on the line or not write it at all, right? Because it used to be pronounced oikodomesen, something like that, right? But over time, it came not to be pronounced. And after it ceased to be pronounced, then a few centuries led to some spelling interchanges so that basically nobody wrote it anymore at all, hardly at all. And that turning point is really as you go from the Hellenistic period to the Roman period. So if you're writing this word in the early Hellenistic period, you are going to write a iota right there after the omega. The fact that there is no iota there here is indicative that we're dealing with the Roman period common scribal practice. So, oko domese. Now the other thing here is that there's no ni here. You might notice when I speak Koine Greek, I always put the ni, the movable ni at the end of my verbs like this. Oko domesen, right? Epiesen, egrapsen, and so on and so forth. Because in the Koine period, especially in the Roman period, that movable nu, which normally only comes at the end of a verb like this if the following word starts with a vowel, just spread everywhere. So even if the following word starts with a consonant, which it does here, you have a tav, t, it's just everywhere. Whereas in classical Greek, you would have just the epsilon if the following word begins with a consonant, but if the following word begins with a vowel, then you would have the nu. Now it's interesting because in this inscription, in the colloquial speech of his day, everyone was probably using the nu. I mean, most people probably were. But the fact that he doesn't write the nu and he keeps the classical rule shows that he's a good scribe, right? He's writing good high-level Greek for a scribe and keeping that epsilon without adding the nu, right? So, oko domese. He built. What did he build? Ten synagogen, the synagogue. And this is significant because we come back to what we said at the beginning. This is a synagogue building inscription. And that's significant because outside of literary references, I mean, you have a synagogue in Jerusalem mentioned in Acts 6. We don't actually have any other physical evidence for a first century synagogue in Jerusalem. So this is it. And that's very significant. It shows us that, yeah, we do have this physical evidence in addition to the literary evidence for the presence of synagogues in Jerusalem in the first century. All right, so ten synagogen, he built a synagogue. Is anagnosin, for reading, anagnosis. So is anagnosin nomu, for the reading of nomos, right? For the reading of the law, for the reading of the Torah, right? That's one of the main activities in a synagogue is you read the Torah for using Hebrew. And it's a common practice attested from ancient times all the way through to modern times. There's a certain amount of a portion of the Torah that you read each week. And the fact that that's mentioned here as one of the main functions of why it was built is consistent with that, right? So, is anagnosin nomu, for the reading of the law, ke is didahen endolon. Notice also how is with the accusative is being used as the for or unto something here. Right, so for the reading of the law, ke is didahen endolon, and for the teaching and for teaching of commandments. Right? And so these are the two main purposes listed here, and we see this echoed in other literary sources from the same era, like in Josephus. These activities are mentioned with the synagogue. Interestingly, prayer is not mentioned, even though it was probably going on in the synagogue, but that might show that these were regarded as the primary purposes of the synagogue. Okay, so now we're going to get another thing that Theodotos built, right? We had ten synagogen he built. Why did he build it? Is anagnosin nomo, ke is didachen endolon, for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments. Now another thing he's going to build, or that he did build, ke ton xenona, and the guest house. Oh, but wait a second. Look at this. If you look at the edge of this line here, you'll see that all of these letters are in line, except here, there's a little iota sticking out. Now, what's going on there? Probably what happened is the scribe wrote kappa, alpha. Okay, it's fine to carry a word onto the next line. Then he forgot that he hadn't written the whole word. And he starts ton xenona. And then he looks back and thinks, oh no! Uh-oh, well, what do we, okay, I'll just, pop. And he pops the little iota there. So that's probably what happened. So we get the little iota, que ton xenona, and the guest house, right? Xenon, from the same stem as things like xenos, right? A guest or someone from abroad. So he built the guest house, ton xenona. Why build a guest house in Jerusalem? Because 3 times in a year, the Jews would go up to Jerusalem for the 3 most important festivals, right? For Pascha, for Passover, for Pentecoste, for Pentecost, and then for Skenopeia, right? For Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, right? And so and Jerusalem would swell in those times, right? Sometimes you get tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 people or more coming in. And so it was really important to have places for people to stay, right? So if you're building a synagogue, and then you're going to also build with it a guest house, that's for pilgrims, right? For people who want to come up, Jews who want to come up to Jerusalem during these festivals is probably one of the main functions there, right? So, ke ton xenona, ke ta, we don't have it here, but we restore it, ke ta domata, right? And the doma is like perhaps house or room, ancillary rooms, the rooms that go with it. Ke ta domata, ke ta chreisteria ton Iudaeae, right? Chreisteria ton Iudaeae. The use of chreisterion here isn't like the classical use, which can mean oracle, but in this case, chreisteria ton Iudaeae probably means something like the water installations or cisterns or some sort of water work. And that could be for, it could connect to the actual city's water, or it could just be sort of a cistern. Now, the significance of this is probably 2 things. One, it was just practical, right? Anytime you're building a house or a lodging, you're going to need access to water, so that's important for practical needs. But then also, right, the idea of ritual purification, right, needing to wash ritually, right? But again, we mentioned being close to the temple. That might also be a factor in that, right? Okay, so que ta chreisteria ton Iudaeae, and the water installation is kataluma. Okay, is kataluma. Right, what is kataluma? Kataluma is like an inn, right? So for a kataluma, an inn or a lodging or something like that. We actually see this word in the Gospels. It's mentioned in Luke, right? Uke naftiustopos ento katalumati. There was not room for them in the inn, right? When Mary and Joseph are looking for a place for Mary to give birth. And then it's also used at the end of the Gospels when it's talking about the room that's going to be prepared for Jesus and his disciples to eat the Passover. There, it's also kataluma. And in this case, it's inn or lodging, right? For a lodging, tis chrezusin. Tis chrezusin. What is chrezo? So tis chrezusin, right? We're dealing with the definite dative participle, right? But chrezo, chrezin means to desire, to want, to be in need of, to lack, right? So is kataluma tis chrezusin. So as a lodging for those who need it, right? So we're talking about pilgrims who come from abroad. If they don't have family in Jerusalem that they can stay with, they need a place to stay, right? And so they'll need a lodging. And so this being adjoined with the synagogue makes a lot of sense in that context, right? Again, we have, I've been saying all this time, it's going to be for people coming from abroad, for pilgrims, and that's what we have right here. Apotes xenes, right? Xene, apotes xenes, from abroad, right? You see in classical Greek, this form might have been xenethen, meaning from abroad with that then suffix. But in this case, and this is perhaps a bit more Koine-ish, to not use that then suffix, but just to say apotes xenes, right? Because that then basically just means from. So it's kind of the same as apo, right? You see things like enthen, right? From here. Ekithen, right? From there. From eki and then. So xenethen, from xene, right? From abroad. Whereas here, apotes xenes, from abroad. So to me, that rings a little bit more like a Koine Greek way of saying that. So again, that's a reference to the pilgrims coming from abroad to use this guest house to use the guest house as they're coming to Jerusalem for these festivals, probably. It didn't have to be during festival time, but that's probably the main idea. Ein, so now we have this relative particle, ein. What does it go back to? Right? It's the feminine accusative relative particle, ein. So it goes back to, where are we now? Synagogue, the synagogue, right? So we're in the synagogue, all these details. Now, ein, which, the synagogue which, ethemeliousan, they founded. Themelion, themeliose, it means to found or establish, right? Themelios is foundation. You get this in Ephesians when it's talking about the church being built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus being the chief cornerstone there. Themelios is the foundation, right? Okay, so ethemeliosan, we have the aorist plural, right? They founded. Who founded? We read as we go on. Iupateres aftu, his fathers, and in this case it means ancestors, right? So, father, grandfather, those before him, we don't know how many generations it goes back, but his fathers, his ancestors. Ke I presbyteri, and the elders, perhaps of an earlier synagogue community or his community. Ke Simonides. Okay, now what's interesting about this? Well, at the beginning, we read that Theodotos domese. Theodotos built ten synagogue, the synagogue. But now at the end, we're reading the synagogue in ethemeliosan, which iupateres aftu, which his fathers founded, and which the elders and Simonides founded. So some scholars have suggested that this means that we're dealing with sort of a transplant synagogue community where they might have had a synagogue elsewhere, perhaps from abroad, and they came and they immigrated to Jerusalem and then built this synagogue there for their community. So when it's talking about the building, it's the physical building that Theodotos did in Jerusalem, but when it's talking about the founding, ethemeliosan, it's talking about the establishing of the community, right? Because if you're talking about multiple generations, father and grandfather, you wonder, would they all help build the synagogue, or is this more something that was founded in the past elsewhere? Now, it's difficult to know for sure exactly how many generations. Maybe it's just one or two. But in any case, that may be the case, that it's a synagogue community from abroad being kind of transplanted into Jerusalem and then building this building together. And Simonides, we don't know exactly who that was, but he obviously was part of the establishing of the synagogue at first. So you can see just how much we get out of this inscription. Let's go back and take a look at the whole thing now, reading together smoothly, right? I'll read it once in Greek for those who know Greek, and I'll read it once again just translating in English. So, Theodotos vetenu irevs ke archisynagogos ios archisynagogou ionos archisynagogou okodomese ten synagogin is anagnosin nomu και εις διδαχήν εντολών και τον ξενώνα και τα δώματα και τα χρεστέρια των υδάτων εις κατάλημα της χρέζουσιν από τες ξένες εν εθεμελίωσαν οι πατέρες αυτού και οι πρεσβύτεροι και Simonides. Theodotos, son of Wetenos, priest and head of a synagogue, the son of the head of a synagogue, the grandson of the head of a synagogue, built the synagogue for the reading of the law and for the teaching of the commandments, and the guest house, and the ancillary rooms, and the water installations for a lodging for those who need it from abroad, which the fathers, his fathers, and the elders and Simonides founded or established. So you can see then just how much you can get out of a short inscription like this, culturally, historically, linguistically. Now, please, if you want to see more videos like this, I can't promise I'm going to have an inscription replica of every inscription that we might read, but if you want to see more videos like this, reading an inscription, maybe papyri, please subscribe, and please note that in the comments that you want to see more, and maybe I can make some more if you're interested. Kenin, tis filusin ten eleniken glosan, ke tis telusin, elenistikalos lalin, ke anaginoskin, eroste.